But then, something truly spectacular happens. First, I apologize that it's been a few weeks since we finished the book of Leviticus. It was actually back in December, and we're just now getting to the book of Numbers. But on the heels of Christmas, many of you know that my precious younger sister-in-law, Jana, passed away suddenly. And we've been dealing with that as a family. Well, here's the good news. Jana loved Jesus. And I'd encourage you to listen to her amazing story on our Women's Ministry Story Night podcast, which you can hear in episode 38. And you can just hear how the Lord has worked throughout Jana's life and why we have hope. And we don't have to grieve like those who have no hope. But we know that she's with the Lord. But back to our verse-by-verse study through the entire Bible. We're going to begin today a new book, the book of Numbers. And it's one of the least read books in Scripture, mostly due to its name. Numbers. Numbers have to do with math. And most of us don't like to deal with math. In fact, when we think of numbers, we tend to think of people like this. There's Ben Wyatt and the accounting guys from Park and Rec. Not very exciting. Well, this book does deal with numbers in that it records 2 censuses. And we'll definitely touch on those censuses quickly. But to dismiss this book because of the title is a mistake. Because when we do that, we miss out on a rich and epic road trip that covers 40 years of incredible events. For a quick overview of what this book of Numbers is about, well, let's check out this fantastic synopsis from the Bible Project.
In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories. But let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
The Bible Project is so well done, and as always, with every book that we're studying, I'd encourage you to take a few minutes to go watch through the entire overview for each book. It'll help to really solidify the context of everything we'll explore in our study through Numbers, which is why right now we're going to address the name of our study. Well, in the English translations, this is called the Book of Numbers. Again, it's not very exciting. Well, we learned from the Bible Project that in Hebrew, the name is more appealing in that it's in the wilderness. Kind of sounds like a movie title. I kind of wish the English translators would take on that Hebrew name because it's so much more appropriate and engaging. So, in figuring out what to call this study, I wanted to call it something that just demolished misconceptions and expectations that Numbers is a dull, lifeless book, which is why we're calling it Desert Storm. Did you hear that? Because that's exactly what the book of Numbers is. Once we get through the first few chapters, just like the Bible Project said, the storyline kind of flows like a gripping, dramatic movie, like a road trip adventure where everything starts off great. But suddenly, it goes horribly wrong until the big climactic moment where God shows up in power and grace. Well, throughout the entire story, there's a storm brewing, a growing darkness warring in the hearts of the Israelites as to whether or not they will be the people of God. Well, today we're going to cover the first couple chapters, which are all about preparing, getting ready, packing up for the road trip, which should last a couple weeks. And from this time of outfitting and getting ready, we're going to discover trust God for your survival. So let's get started with chapter 1, verse 1. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. Well, a few important things to note here. Number one, where they're at. They are here at Mount Sinai, which we've learned is not likely the traditional site identified on the Sinai Peninsula by Constantine's mother in the 4th century AD, but rather here, where the Bible places it, in the ancient land of Midian, beyond the Yam Suf, or the border sea. And from this time marker here, we know that they've been here at Mount Sinai for about a year, and that it's now the second month of the second year after they left Egypt. Well, finally, notice that Moses is now meeting with the Lord from inside the tent of meeting, or what's called the Tabernacle. Remember, the book of Leviticus started with the Lord speaking to Moses from the tent of meeting? Because Moses couldn't enter, he was outside the tent listening. But Leviticus laid out various sacrifices and celebrations, providing access to the very presence of the Lord. So now, here at the beginning of Numbers, Moses is actually able to have access to meet the Lord in the tent of meeting. He, that's Yahweh, he said, take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name, one by one, which is why the Greek translation of this book and our English Bibles title this book, the Book of Numbers. Because of the census taken here, there's actually two censuses. One will be taken now at the start of the journey, and then almost 40 years later, a second census will be taken in chapter 26, and we'll see how the population of this nation grew or shrank over this road trip through the wilderness, through the desert. Well, how did they fare during this desert storm? Did you hear that? A storm is brewing. Well, the Lord continues, you, that's Moses, you and Aaron are to count according to their divisions all the men in Israel who are 20 years old or more and able to serve in the army. It kind of reminds me of another census we read about hundreds of years later in the age of the kings, when King David almost destroyed the nation by taking a census in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Well, that census was David's greatest mistake, even bigger and more devastating than his mistake with Bathsheba. So how is this census God is commanding Moses to take different? Because this census is about getting ready and organized to move a massive amount of people, a nation of over 2 million people, through the wilderness. While David's census was to count how many fighting men were in his army to prove what a great and mighty king he was and all that he had accomplished, completely forgetting that it was God who gave him everything he had, forgetting that even King David had been completely dependent upon God to survive. But he forgot that truth, and it cost him. Back to Numbers. One man from each tribe, each of them, the head of his family, is to help you. These are the names of the men who are to assist you. And you can see there down through verse 15, the name of each person who is in charge of taking the census for their particular tribe. Down to verse 16. These were the men appointed from the community, the leaders of their ancestral tribes. They were the heads of the clans of Israel. Moses and Aaron took these men whose names had been specified and they called the whole community together on the first day of the second month. The people registered their ancestry by their clans and families, and the men 20 years old or more were listed by name, one by one, as Yahweh commanded Moses. And so he counted them in the desert of Sinai, registering their families according to their ancestry, their tribe. Not unlike how Joseph and Mary had to register according to their ancestry in Bethlehem, which began the journey of Jesus' incarnation into humanity. The next few paragraphs down to verse 42 give the numbers, the results of the census. And what's really interesting here is to compare the results of the census here at Mount Sinai with the results from the census taken almost 40 years later in chapter 26. We can see in the chart the comparison of the numbers here in the first census compared to 40 years later. For example, the tribe of Reuben here is counted at 46,500 men. Well, over the next 40 years, they'll lose 2,770 men in population. We can see the tribe of Simeon is kind of absolutely decimated in that they lose over 65% of their population, while Judah, being the largest tribe at 74,600, actually increases by 1,900 people. On down through the rest of the tribes, each either adding population or losing, down to the overall number in verse 44. These were the men counted by Moses and Aaron and the 12 leaders of Israel, each one representing his family. All the Israelites 20 years old or more who were able to serve in Israel's army were counted according to their families. The total number was 603,550. So 603,550 fighting men over the age of 20 as they packed up camp at Mount Sinai, which, adding in women and children, would put the population somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 million people. Well, 40 years later, at the second census, taken right before they entered the Promised Land, they counted them at 601,730, which means they actually had a minuscule decline in population of negative 0.3%, which statistically means during the 40 years, they basically achieved zero population growth, which is really hard for a nation of 2 to 3 million people to do. Naturally, there will be a tremendous population growth. Remember, the Israelites had been multiplying like rabbits for the previous 400 years in captivity in Egypt, growing from a family of 12 brothers into a nation of 2 to 3 million people. So what happened? Why did this formerly fruitful nation growing like gangbusters over 400 years suddenly stop multiplying? Well, the book of Numbers is what happened, which was a desert storm. Did you hear that? A storm is building. And that storm will be violent and rough. Their trip should have taken 2 weeks, or for at the most a month, but it takes them 40 years. In fact, we'll see that out of this entire population of 603,550 men over the age of 20, guess how many will still be alive 40 years later to enter the Promised Land? 2. Caleb and Joshua. The other 603,548 men will die on the journey because of what happens in the wilderness, because of the desert storm. These 2 to 3 million people will be entering into the barren wilderness between Mount Sinai and the Promised Land, which even to this day is one of the most hostile and desolate places on the planet. And they'll be camping, living in tents and living off the desert, where the only food, water, and supplies they'll have to survive off of will be provided for them by the Lord. There'll be no other source. Literally, the only way to survive this journey will be if they are completely dependent upon God. Well, they were learning They were learning to trust God for their survival, which was a lesson they needed to and we need to grasp, because it's true beyond the journey through the wilderness. It'll be true for them once they reach the promised land. And it's equally true for us. In order to survive in the land, they needed to learn they are dependent upon God to survive. Well, those who depend upon God, they will survive. When those who look to other sources or who are dependent upon their own abilities or strength, they won't make it. Verse 47, the ancestral tribes of the Levites, however, was not counted along with the others. Yahweh had said to Moses, you must not count the tribe of Levi or include them in the census of the other Israelites. Instead, appoint the Levites to be in charge of the tabernacle of the covenant law, over all its furnishings and everything belonging to it. They are to carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings. They are to take care of it and encamp around it. The census was kind of like what we would call a military draft. It was counting men who could fight, who were 20 years and older, potential soldiers, because a desert storm was coming. Not just the war over whether or not they would depend upon God to survive, but the battle to take the promised land from the Canaanite tribes who lived there. But the Levites, they were not to be soldiers because they were set apart or holy. They had unique duties in taking care of the tabernacle and representing the rest of Israel as priests before God. 51. Whenever the tabernacle is to move, the Levites are to take it down. And whenever the tabernacle is to be set up, the Levites shall do it. Well, that's the job of the Levites and their job alone. Anyone else who approaches it is to be put to death, which we'll read more about in chapter 3. The Israelites are to set up their tents by divisions, each of them in their own camp under their standard. So each tribe will have a flag or a banner, a standard that identifies their tribe. The Levites, however, are to set up their tents around the tabernacle of the covenant law so that my wrath will not fall on the Israelite community. The Levites are to be responsible for the care of the tabernacle of the covenant law. The Israelites did all of this just as Yahweh had commanded Moses, which as we move into chapter 2, we'll see how all of this camp will be laid out. Now, most of us have been camping and we've seen something like this. Here's the campground map for Silver Falls State Park with the A Loop and the B Loop and with designated campsites for various types of camping, whether in a tent or RV. Or here's another one from Harris Beach, which is down by Brookings on the South Oregon coast, with the same numbering system so you can identify and pay for the campsite that you're staying in. Or here's this one. Most of us have stayed at some time at Fort Stevens. Well, this huge complex with over 14 loops to camp in, but organized in a way that you can reserve and find your campsite and know where you and your family are authorized to stay. Well, this is exactly what chapter 2 is. It's a campground map for the Israelites for their journey that should take 2 weeks, but ends up taking 40 years. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly go through it and map out a campground map according to what it says. To begin with is the center of the campground, which we read at the beginning of chapter 2. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, the Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting some distance from it. Thus, at the center of the camp is the tabernacle, the tent that is the earthly model of the actual throne room of God in heaven. Well, most campgrounds are built around a natural feature like a lake or a river or an ocean, usually the very reason why the camp exists in the first place. Well, this campground will be built around the throne of God, where the earthly model of God's throne room, his leadership as king, is at the center of their camp. The very reason why their nation and this camp exists in the first place. He's at the center of their lives because they'll be absolutely dependent upon God to survive this journey. They had to learn this principle because it was a lesson every follower of God needs to grasp. During this difficult time in the desert, they'll be learning to trust God for their survival. That lesson will be drilled into their hearts again and again, starting with what was at the center of their camp, the very throne of God. But a desert storm is brewing. So within this camp, how will they know which side is theirs? Well, let's find out. The Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting, some distance from it, each of them under their standard and holding the banners of the family. When we go camping in a campground, we identify our spot to camp with one of these. A camp marker, a marker in the ground that identifies the loop we are in and the number of our campsite within that loop. What was the marker for the Israelite campground? It was a flag, a portable banner, or what's called a standard, that they could follow as a tribe while traveling and plant on the ground in the location they were to set up their tents. Just like our campsite markers let us know where we're able to set up our tents or park our RVs for all you glampers out there. Well, here's the rest of the Israelite campground. On the east, towards the sunrise, the divisions of the camp of Judah are to encamp under their standard. Well, we already know from our study through Exodus and God's instructions to Moses on how to set up the tabernacle that the door, the gate into the tabernacle complex, and the door or gate into the tent itself are to be set up to the east towards the sunrise. The first and second temples in Jerusalem, they were built in the same way. And the third temple, which I'm convinced will be built soon in Jerusalem, will have its gates facing east towards the sunrise. This is important here as we see the setup of the camp, as the first tribe's location where Judah is to pitch their tents is to be to the east of the tabernacle at the center of camp. Well, from verse 9, we find out that this is like what we would call Loop A in modern campground, only this camping loop was called the Camp of Judah. And verses 5 through 8 tell us two more tribes, the tribes of Issachar and Zebulun, are to pitch their tents in this Judah loop to the east of the tabernacle. We read in verse 9, all the men assigned to the camp, or what we're calling a loop, of Judah, according to their divisions, number 186,400. They will set out first. So when it's time to move, when the pillar of cloud by day or fire by night moves, and they're to pick up and leave the camp to move to the next, the first tribe to set out to follow the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant or throne of God would be all those in the Judah loop. The tribe of Judah first, followed by Issachar and Zebulun, followed by the Reuben loop. On the south will be the divisions of the camp of Reuben under their standard. To the south of the tabernacle is this Reuben loop, starting with the tribe of Reuben. Next to them would be the tribes of Simeon and Gad, down to verse 16. All the men assigned to the camp of Reuben, according to their divisions, number 151,450. They will set out second. When they break camp, the Ark of the Covenant leads out, followed by Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Then comes Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Then the tent of meeting and the camp of the Levites will set out in the middle of the camps. They will set out in the same order as they encamp, each in their own place under their standard. Well, we'll read all about the Levites and all this in the next couple chapters, as the tribe of Levi was set apart, different, holy. Well, they camped right next to the tabernacle in specific spots. So as they followed the pillar of cloud and the Ark of the Covenant, then the Judah loop, followed by the Reuben loop, next would come the tribe of Levi carrying all the materials and supplies and furniture of the tabernacle. Then came the Ephraim loop, Verse 18, on the west will be the divisions of the camp of Ephraim under their standard. Well, to the west of the tabernacle comes the Ephraim Loop, starting with the tribe of Ephraim, next to them the tribe of Manasseh, next to them the tribe of Benjamin, down to verse 24. All the men assigned to the camp of Ephraim according to their divisions number 108,100. They will set out third. Finally comes the Dan Loop. On the north will be the divisions of the camp of Dan under their standard. North of the tabernacle, we find the Dan Loop, where the tribe of Dan sets up their tent. Next to them, the tribes of Asher, and then next to them, the tribe of Naphtali. Down to verse 31, all the men assigned to the camp of Dan number 157,600. They will set out last under their standards. So you get the picture here, not only of the Israelite campground map, but how they were to set out and travel between campsites. I mean, it was like a parade of God declaring, these are my people, with the pillar of cloud and the Ark of the Covenant leading, followed by the Judah Loop, the Reuben Loop, the Levites and the tabernacle gear, followed by the Ephraim Loop, and then finally the Dan Loop. Well, verse 32, these are the Israelites, counted according to their families, all the men in the camps by their divisions, number 603,550. The Levites, however, were not counted along with the other Israelites as Yahweh commanded Moses. So the Israelites did everything Yahweh commanded Moses. That is the way they encamped under their standards. And that is the way they set out, each of them with their clan and family. You can see this wasn't going to be a ragtag, haphazard group of refugees traveling from Sinai to the land of the Canaanites, but rather a well-organized machine of warriors, God's people, following Yahweh into the land he was giving to them as he promised. He was their king. He was their leader. And the earthly representation of his throne in heaven was at the very center of their camp, guiding the way. And whether or not they survived this trip was not dependent upon their skills as survivors or as warriors. They were completely dependent upon God to survive this journey. And most of them, in fact, 603,548 of these men, will die in the desert. But their deaths will not be in vain, because their children and grandchildren, the next generations, learned the lesson well. Trust God for your survival, which is what we'll discover in just a few months when we get to the book of Joshua and we see their children and grandchildren completely dependent upon the Lord as their king. And they take the promised land because they do trust God for their survival under the leadership of Joshua. Now, I promised you, as we began this book, an epic adventure. And so far, it's a campground map. Not very exciting. But trust me, this is all just preparation for what's to come, getting ready for the road trip. And the desert storm is coming. But I want to close by talking about the layout, because it's really interesting. One, because this is no run-of-the-mill campground map. This campground was laid out and designed by God. I want you to know that we don't know exactly what the camp looked like from place to place. I mean, you can see, here's the campground map we came up with just from reading the text. And there's other ideas, such as this one that doesn't take such a literal approach to what it says, but a different approach that finds a way to place each tribe nearer to the tabernacle, but still true to the text that we've read today. And it's very possible that this is a more accurate campground map, that this is how they stayed at each camp. We have no way of knowing, but maybe it's the Hallmark Channel in me. But the way I like to map it out is as literally as we can according to what we read here in Numbers chapter 2. But then something truly spectacular happens when we factor in the populations and the size of each tribe from Numbers chapter 1. If we adjust the space needed for each tribe to set up camp in relation to their population, the size of their tribe, then this happens. A distinct shape is clearly seen when the camp layout is viewed from above. Again, I wouldn't base a theology off this, but I find it fascinating that as the Israelites camped in the desert over 40 years, each time they made camp, their camp formed the shape of a cross. In fact, we'll call this the Camp of Israel cross, with the tabernacle, the very throne of God at the heart, the very junction of the cross beams. When you realize the lambs and the animals were sacrificed there at the center of camp, it only makes it more powerful that every time the Israelites set up their camp, unknowingly, they were foreshadowing the Lamb of God, who would one day sacrifice his life to save us. You think that's an accident? Nothing God does is accidental. It's all on purpose to reveal his wonder and the glory of who he is. This nation, whose very purpose as God's chosen people was to deliver the Messiah, the Savior, to one day die on a Roman cross to pay the consequences for the sins of the world. And the ultimate way to trust God for your survival is to make that Savior, Jesus Christ, the King of your life. But we're not done yet with camp preparations before we see the Israelites break camp and leave Sinai. A few more preparations need to be done, which we'll get into next week before the desert storm that's brewing arrives. God bless you all.